The Tech on Demand podcast brought to you by GROWERTALKS. Audio Files, Episode 70. Success by Design. The Secret Strategy for Quality Vegetatively Propagated Spring Crops. From the January 2026 issue of GROWERTALKS magazine, written by Christopher J. Currey, narrated by Bill Calkins. Success by Design. The secret strategy for quality vegetatively propagated spring crops isn't too complicated. Healthy cuttings, healthy rooted liners, healthy finished crops. While much is written and discussed about managing fertilizer when finishing containerized spring crops, managing nutrients during cutting propagation receives less attention. But to produce healthy rooted cuttings, cutting fertilization needs to be managed across all 5 stages of liner production. Stage 0, prior to harvest or arrival of cuttings. Stage 1, cuttings, arrival and sticking. Stage 2, callusing. Stage 3, root development. And Stage 4, toning. Managing macro and micronutrients. In a nod to George Orwell's Animal Farm, all nutrients are equally essential, but some are more essential than others. There are certain nutrients to focus on providing cuttings or not, and promoting their uptake and assimilation. Starting with the primary macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, what we provide and how much will vary throughout propagation. Nitrogen is required in the largest amount by plants. Not only does it promote green foliage, but it also can promote vegetative growth. While you need to provide sufficient nitrogen to keep both developing and mature foliage green, you don't want to provide so much that excessive growth occurs. Start off by providing low concentrations of fertilizer during Stage 2 callusing. As cuttings progress through Stage 3 root development, fertilizer concentration should increase as root growth increases and shoot growth resumes. To help harden and suppress excessive growth, nitrogen concentrations can be reduced during Stage 4 toning, much like at the end of a finished flowering containerized crop. There's the idea that phosphorus promotes root development and therefore that increasing phosphorus concentrations can improve rooting. This is analogous to the idea that increasing phosphorus concentrations increases flowering when finishing flowering crops. The problem with increasing phosphorus concentrations is that it'll also increase stretch, which is almost always undesirable and something we actively suppress when growing containerized ornamentals. Selecting fertilizer formulations with low concentrations of phosphorus, like those formulated for seedling plug production, are great for minimizing phosphorus application during cutting fertilization. Out of the 3 secondary macronutrients, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, calcium can be the biggest concern during propagation. Calcium is involved in rapid cellular division and expansion, occurring both at the apical meristem of shoots as well as in newly developing roots and primordia. A particular problem is when insufficient calcium is taken up by Petunia or Calibrachoa cuttings. The meristem ceases to develop and exhibits clubby-looking growth, and axillary buds start developing into branches prematurely. While calcium deficiency can certainly be caused by insufficient calcium provided to plants, it can also result from insufficient uptake resulting from less than ideal greenhouse conditions, both of which will be discussed later. Micronutrients, including boron, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc, are no exception to what needs to be considered when fertilizing cuttings. In fact, many of the new vegetatively propagated species and cultivars being introduced to the marketplace have higher micronutrient requirements than seed-propagated crops. However, it can be challenging to provide sufficient micronutrients during propagation when lower nitrogen concentrations are being used. Micronutrients are most commonly provided as part of a complete balanced fertilizer formulation and are mixed in their proportion to nitrogen. When less nitrogen is provided, so are less micronutrients. This can be corrected by selecting a fertilizer with elevated micronutrient concentrations that'll provide more micronutrients at lower nitrogen concentrations. For example, the peat light formulations of 20-10-20 and 15-5-15 have twice the micronutrient concentration of the regular formulations, and J.R. Peters' boosted base fertilizer has around twice the micronutrient concentrations of peat light formulation. These fertilizers with increased micronutrient concentrations aren't just great for finishing containerized annuals, They're great for fertilizing cuttings at low nitrogen concentrations too. Balancing moisture and mineral nutrients. One of the challenges with managing mineral nutrients in cuttings during the rooting process is how to deal with moisture, both in the substrate as well as in the air. Once unrooted cuttings have been stuck into the substrate and moved into the greenhouse, producers strive to promote hydration and minimize wilt. There are two primary methods of keeping cuttings hydrated. One, applying intermittent mist or misting cuttings, and two, keeping the atmosphere humidified and at a high humidity above 95%. Ideally, producers have misting and humidifying capacity and are able to pull the levers on both. Mist is used to help maintain turgid cuttings while also humidifying the environment. However, mist applications moisten the substrate, and excessive misting in saturated substrates reduce the opportunity to provide water-soluble fertilizer through irrigation. Saturated substrates can also reduce the active uptake of some nutrients like iron, with deficiencies developing with excessively wet root zones. Additionally, excessive leaching removes nutrients not only from the substrate but from the plant tissue as well. The best approach to misting is a balancing act. Work to use as little mist as needed while not stressing cuttings. But it isn't just excessive mist and saturated substrates we're worried about in propagation, it's the humidity or vapor pressure deficit, VPD, of the atmosphere too. Water moves from the plant toward a less humid or more negative VPD environment. As a result, when cuttings are initially stuck and placed in the greenhouse, high humidity or lower VPD reduces water loss and keeps cuttings turgid and healthy. However, while this reduces water loss, it also reduces transpiration, the loss of water through stomata, and therefore water uptake. For nutrients like calcium and magnesium, this reduces their uptake and assimilation by the plant, since these nutrients are passively taken up along with water, unlike other nutrients which are taken up actively. While minimizing water loss is great, especially during stage 1 and early stage 2 transpiration, and water uptake is also important for nutrient uptake, so the humidity should be reduced or VPD increased as propagation proceeds. The same principle applies to humidity or VPD as it does with mist. Work towards reducing the humidity and increasing the VPD as cuttings progress through stage 1, cutting arrival, and sticking to stage 4, toning, to promote water and nutrient uptake by the cuttings. Fertilizer forms and norms. Using water-soluble fertilizer to fertilize liners provides the most flexibility for producers. Fertilizer can be applied through misting or irrigation at any time during propagation. Additionally, in many instances, the concentration can be changed, as can the stock solution, and therefore the fertilizer formulation the injector is drawing from. There's no denying water-soluble fertilizers are the most flexible tool for fertilizing cuttings. However, although water-soluble fertilizers are the norm, controlled-release fertilizer is an effective form of fertilizer for propagating cuttings. By incorporating controlled-release fertilizer into substrate prior to sticking cuttings, fertilizer will be provided to cuttings throughout the entirety of propagation. There are a few considerations for using controlled-release fertilizers for liner propagation. First, use a controlled-release fertilizer available as a micro-prill. By using smaller than standard prills, the controlled-release fertilizer will be more evenly distributed into the substrate and across the tray of cuttings. You can select different release rates depending on your goal. A 2 to 3 month or 3 to 4 month release period is usually sufficient for liner production. Just keep in mind that to provide comparable amounts of fertilizer during propagation, you'll need to increase the amount of controlled release fertilizer used as the release rate increases to compensate for the slower release rate, and decrease the amount of controlled release fertilizer used as the release rate increases to compensate for the faster release rate. While the choice of fertilizer forms has been presented as an either-or proposition, using both is certainly an option, and a great one at that. Much like for finishing annuals or garden mums, using a combination of water-soluble fertilizer and controlled-release fertilizer can be a great approach. By using a 1/4 to 1/2 rate of controlled-release fertilizer, combined with a similarly low concentration of water-soluble fertilizer, you can reap the benefits of both fertilizer, a flexibility of water-soluble, and the consistency of controlled release, while minimizing drawbacks by using complementary fertilizers. Transplanting the takeaways. When healthy, unrooted cuttings arrive, it's time to implement your nutrient management plan. Be prepared with the appropriate fertilizer formulations and injection equipment calibrated. Beginning in callusing, your fertilizer application will maintain and enhance cutting health as roots and shoots develop, and how the greenhouse environment and irrigation practices are managed will interact with fertilizer applications and nutrient uptake. Working through the different stages of liner production, you don't want to just set it and forget it with cutting fertilization. The end. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Audio Files from the Tech on Demand podcast brought to you by Grower Talks. Please take a minute to leave us a positive review. It'll help us reach more greenhouse, garden center, and CEA professionals.